Welcome to Sleepy Histories. Tonight, let your mind drift back to the cradle of civilization, ancient Mesopotamia, where the great rivers Tigris and Euphrates flow like silver threads through a sleeping desert. Imagine soft winds brushing over mud-brick temples and ziggurats that reach quietly for the stars. Hear the distant hum of life along the canals, the whisper of reeds swaying by the water's edge, and the slow turning of time in a world of kings, scribes, and timeless myths. As always, be sure to let us know in the comments what city you're listening from, and please let us know what topics you'd like us to cover in the future. Now close your eyes and let the ancient stories of Sumer, Babylon, and Assyria wrap around you like a warm blanket, easing you into a calm, restful sleep where history flows gently, like a dream. The year was 3500 BC, and beneath a merciless sun that scorched the earth like bronze in a smith's forge, two rivers carved their serpentine paths through an endless expanse of dust and dreams. Here, in this desolate cradle between the Tigris and Euphrates, humanity would write its first chapter in blood, mud, and ambition. A story that would echo through millennia before crumbling into the very dust from which it arose. The Mesopotamian plain stretched like a vast graveyard of possibilities, its horizon shimmering with mirages that promised water but delivered only more burning sand. Yet within this harsh wilderness, something extraordinary was stirring. Nomadic tribes, weathered by countless seasons of wandering, began to settle along the riverbanks, their eyes fixed not on the sky for divine intervention, but on the earth itself. Muddy, fertile, and pregnant with potential, these were not the gentle farmers of popular imagination, but desperate survivors clawing civilization from chaos. The first settlements emerged like blisters on the landscape, small mounds of mud brick and human determination rising from the alluvial plains. Eridu, Uruk, Ur, names that would later resonate through history like funeral bells, marking the graves of humanity's innocence. Each settlement was a fortress against the void, a declaration of defiance against a universe that seemed determined to reduce all human effort to dust. The transformation was neither gentle nor gradual. As the centuries rolled past like funeral processions, these scattered villages began to swell with an almost cancerous urgency. The Sumerians, as history would name them, developed not just agriculture, but the tools of domination: writing, mathematics, astronomy, and law. Their cuneiform script pressed into wet clay tablets told stories of gods who were as cruel and capricious as the natural world they had supposedly created. These deities demanded blood, demanded submission, demanded that mortals build monuments to immortal vanity. The ziggurat of Ur rose like a geometrical mountain, its terraced sides ascending toward heaven in a mockery of natural peaks. From its summit, priest-kings gazed across a landscape they controlled through a combination of divine authority and very earthly violence. The city-states of Sumer were not peaceful republics, but competing predators, each seeking to devour its neighbors in an endless cycle of warfare and conquest. Trade routes stretched like arteries across the known world, pumping wealth into these urban hearts that beat with increasing irregularity. Merchants carried not just goods, but ideas, diseases, and conflicts across vast distances. The very success of Mesopotamian civilization contained the seeds of its eventual decay. Prosperity bred complexity, complexity bred vulnerability, and vulnerability would prove to be the civilization's fatal flaw. Around 2334 BC, Sargon of Akkad emerged from obscurity like a plague given human form. His conquest of Sumer marked not liberation, but the beginning of a new kind of horror, imperial ambition on a scale the world had never witnessed. The Akkadian Empire stretched its grasping fingers across the Fertile Crescent, demanding tribute from lands as distant as modern-day Turkey and Iran. Yet empires, like the men who build them, are mortal things, and Sargon's creation would prove as fragile as the clay tablets on which his victories were recorded. The collapse came not with the dramatic flourish of Hollywood imagination, but with the slow, grinding inevitability of geological time. Drought withered the fields that had once fed millions. Salt, that white poison of agricultural ambition, began to accumulate in soil that had been over-irrigated for centuries. The very engineering marvels that had made Mesopotamian prosperity possible, the canals, the reservoirs, the complex network of water management, became instruments of ecological disaster. An ancient civilization that ruled Mesopotamia nearly 4,000 years ago was likely wiped out because of disastrous dust storms, a new study suggests. The Akkadian Empire, which had seemed as permanent as the stars themselves, crumbled not before the swords of enemies, but before the inexorable advance of environmental catastrophe. Cities that had thrived for over a millennium were abandoned almost overnight, their populations scattered like seeds on barren ground. Yet from these ashes, new powers arose with the terrible persistence of desert flowers blooming after rain. Babylon emerged in the early 2nd millennium BC, its very name becoming synonymous with decadence and imperial overreach. The Code of Hammurabi, carved in stone and distributed throughout the empire, represented humanity's first systematic attempt to codify justice. Though it was a justice that recognized slavery, endorsed brutal punishment, and reinforced social hierarchies as rigid as the ziggurats themselves. The Babylonian Empire reached its zenith under Nebuchadnezzar II, whose hanging gardens were counted among the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Yet these gardens, if they existed at all, were built by slaves and watered with the tears of conquered peoples. The very magnificence of Babylon was a testament to human suffering on an industrial scale. The city's walls, thick enough for 4 horse-drawn chariots to ride abreast, could not protect against the rot that was already eating at the empire's foundations. To the north, the Assyrians were perfecting the art of terror as statecraft. Their armies moved across the landscape like locusts, leaving devastation in their wake. The Assyrian military machine was remarkable not for its honor or nobility, but for its systematic brutality. They invented psychological warfare, using fear as a weapon more effective than bronze or iron. Entire populations were relocated, cultures were deliberately destroyed, and resistance was met with atrocities that shocked even their ancient contemporaries. In 884 BC, the Neo-Assyrian Empire collapsed suddenly 272 years later in 612 BC, leaving the capital of Nineveh abandoned for more than 100 years. The fall of Nineveh was so complete, so absolute, that later generations would mistake its ruins for natural hills. The city that had once been the administrative center of the largest empire the world had ever seen became a hunting ground for jackals and a nesting place for owls. The Neo-Babylonian Empire that followed was Mesopotamia's final magnificent convulsion, a last desperate attempt at greatness before the long slide into historical irrelevance. Under Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon became a cosmopolitan metropolis where Greek merchants rubbed shoulders with Egyptian priests, where Indian mathematicians debated with Persian astronomers, where the accumulated wisdom of centuries was preserved in libraries that rivaled Alexandria. But this renaissance was built on foundations already cracking with age. The irrigation systems that had sustained Mesopotamian civilization for 3 millennia were breaking down, not through neglect, but through the accumulated damage of centuries of use. Salt deposits had rendered vast areas of once fertile land utterly barren. The population, which had once numbered in the millions, was declining steadily as people fled the increasingly difficult conditions. The Persian conquest of 539 BC was not so much a military victory as a mercy killing. Cyrus the Great entered Babylon not as a conqueror, but as a liberator, welcomed by a population weary of their own rulers' incompetence. The famous Cyrus Cylinder, often called the first charter of human rights, proclaimed tolerance and freedom for all the empire's subjects. a stark contrast to the brutal authoritarianism that had characterized Mesopotamian rule for centuries. Yet even under Persian rule, Mesopotamia continued its slow decline. The focus of power had shifted westward, toward the Mediterranean and the emerging Greek city-states. The great cities of Sumer and Akkad became administrative backwaters. Their ancient temples maintained more from historical curiosity than religious devotion. Alexander the Great would die in Babylon in 323 BC, but by then the city was already a shadow of its former self, a tourist destination for Greek intellectuals fascinated by its exotic ruins. The Seleucid Empire that emerged from Alexander's fragmented conquests attempted to revive Mesopotamian fortunes, but it was too late. The new capital at Seleucia on Tigris drew population and resources away from the ancient cities. Babylon persisted for several more centuries, but it was a zombie city, animated more by historical inertia than by any genuine vitality. The Parthians and Sassanids who followed made their capitals elsewhere, viewing Mesopotamia as a wealthy province to be exploited rather than a homeland to be nurtured. The great irrigation works fell into disrepair, not through any single catastrophic event, but through the gradual withdrawal of the massive human effort required to maintain them. Canals silted up, dikes crumbled, and the desert reclaimed fields that had been cultivated for 3,000 years. The Arab conquest of the 7th century AD brought new life to the region, but it was a different kind of civilization entirely. Baghdad, founded in 762 AD, became a great center of Islamic learning and culture, but it was built on a different site and organized according to different principles than the ancient Mesopotamian cities. The continuity was geographical rather than cultural. The DNA of Sumerian civilization had finally been broken. Archaeological excavations in the 19th and 20th centuries revealed the full extent of what had been lost. More than 150 years separate the first excavations in Mesopotamia, adventurous expeditions involving great personal risks, far from the protection of helpful authorities, from those of the present day with their specialist staffs, modern technical equipment, and objectives wider than the mere search for valuable antiquities. What they uncovered was not just the ruins of cities and palaces, but evidence of humanity's first great experiment in civilized living and its first great failure. The clay tablets that survived in their millions told a story of human ambition and human folly written in humanity's earliest script. Administrative records revealed the crushing bureaucracy that had strangled innovation, while religious texts showed a worldview dominated by fear and superstition. Mathematical treatises demonstrated remarkable sophistication alongside astronomical observations that were surprisingly accurate. Yet these achievements were overshadowed by legal codes that institutionalized slavery and epic poems that glorified warfare. The environmental data was perhaps most damning of all. Soil samples showed the gradual salinization that had turned the Fertile Crescent into a desert. Pollen records revealed the systematic deforestation that had stripped the landscape of its natural protection against erosion. Climate data suggested that human activity had created a feedback loop of environmental degradation that made the region increasingly uninhabitable. Modern Iraq, sitting atop the ruins of Mesopotamian greatness, serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of human achievement. The very ground on which Baghdad stands is layered with the debris of fallen empires, each thinking itself eternal, each ultimately reduced to archaeological curiosities. The Tigris and Euphrates still flow, but they carry less water than they once did, their flow regulated by dams in Turkey and Iran that prioritize modern needs over historical sentiment. The final irony of Mesopotamian civilization is that its greatest achievements, writing, law, urban planning, mathematics, survived and flourished, but only by abandoning their birthplace. The Phoenicians carried alphabetic writing across the Mediterranean. The Jews preserved legal traditions in exile. The Greeks and Romans built upon Mesopotamian mathematical and astronomical knowledge. The innovations that had made Mesopotamia the cradle of civilization ultimately outgrew their creator. Like children who surpass their parents and move on to greater things, recent archaeological discoveries continue to revise our understanding of Mesopotamian chronology and achievements, but they cannot revive the civilization itself. The new discovery indicates that the largest irrigation canals date to the prehistory of Mesopotamia. That means they are much older than the birth of the city by about 1,000 years. Each new finding only emphasizes how much was lost when this first great experiment in human organization finally collapsed. The museums of the world are filled with Mesopotamian artifacts, cylinder seals and royal crowns, mathematical tablets and astronomical instruments, golden jewelry and iron weapons. These objects, preserved in climate-controlled cases and studied by scholars, have achieved a kind of immortality that their creators could never have imagined. Yet they are immortal only as corpses are immortal, preserved through the very absence of life that once animated them. The ghosts of Mesopotamia haunt more than just the museums and archaeological sites. They whisper warnings in the corridors of every modern empire, reminding the powerful that their towers of steel and glass are no more permanent than the ziggurats of mud brick that preceded them. They echo in every environmental crisis, every civilizational collapse, every moment when human ambition overreaches human wisdom. The ultimate lesson of Mesopotamian civilization is not that human achievement is meaningless, but that it is tragic in the classical sense. Noble, magnificent, and doomed. The Sumerians, Babylonians, and Assyrians achieved wonders that still inspire awe 5 millennia later, but they could not escape the fundamental contradiction at the heart of all civilized existence. The need to create order in a universe that tends toward chaos, to build permanence from materials that are inherently temporary, to achieve immortality through institutions that are as mortal as the individuals who create them. The dust that covers the ruins of Ur and Babylon is not just the debris of collapsed buildings, but the physical manifestation of entropy itself, the universal principle that all complex systems, no matter how sophisticated or well designed, eventually break down and return to their component elements. The ziggurats that once seemed to touch the heavens now serve as hills for shepherds to graze their flocks, and the great libraries that once preserved the accumulated wisdom of ages have become mere tells marking the spots where knowledge once flourished. Yet perhaps there is a kind of victory in this defeat, a triumph that transcends the merely material. The Mesopotamians set in motion the great human project of civilization, with all its glories and horrors, its achievements and its failures. They proved that human beings could rise above the level of mere survival, could create beauty and meaning and knowledge, even if they could not create permanence. They showed that it was possible, at least temporarily, to build something greater than the sum of its parts, to create systems of organization and meaning that could sustain millions of people across thousands of years. The price of this achievement was always clear to those who paid it. The ancient Mesopotamian texts are filled with a melancholy awareness of mortality, a recognition that all human endeavors are temporary. The Epic of Gilgamesh, perhaps the first great work of world literature, is fundamentally about the impossibility of avoiding death, the futility of seeking immortality through heroic deeds. Gilgamesh learns that he cannot save his friend Enkidu, cannot save himself, cannot even save the plant of immortality he briefly possesses. Yet the poem survives, copied and recopied by generations of scribes, translated into multiple languages, studied by scholars who can barely imagine the world that created it. This is the paradox of Mesopotamian legacy. The civilization died, but the idea of civilization lived on. The technologies were abandoned, but the principle of technological innovation survived. The empires crumbled, but the concept of empire persisted. The cities were deserted, but the urban way of life spread across the globe. The particular failed, but the universal endured. In the end, Mesopotamia's greatest creation was not any specific invention or institution, but the precedent itself, the proof that human beings could organize themselves into something more complex and capable than a tribe or clan, could create lasting institutions and preserve knowledge across generations, could build monuments that would outlast their builders and stories that would outlive their tellers. Every subsequent civilization, from the Egyptians to the Chinese to the modern West, has been in some sense an attempt to repeat and improve upon the Mesopotamian experiment. The silence that now blankets the ruins of Babylon is the silence of completion rather than failure. Mesopotamia accomplished what it set out to do. It lifted humanity from prehistory into history, from barbarism into civilization, from the animal level of existence into something recognizably human. That this achievement could not be sustained forever does not diminish its significance. If anything, it enhances it by demonstrating the enormous effort and sacrifice required to create and maintain civilized life. The wind that blows across the empty plains where Nineveh once stood carries with it the dust of kings and slaves, of priests and merchants, of poets and warriors, all reduced to the same elemental particles that will someday claim our own achievements. This is not a cause for despair, but for a kind of cosmic humility, a recognition that we are part of a story much larger than ourselves, participants in an ongoing experiment in civilized living that began in the mud of ancient Mesopotamia and continues in the concrete and steel of modern cities. The archaeological sites of Iraq, when they are not being destroyed by war or looted by treasure hunters, continue to yield new insights into humanity's first great civilizational experiment. Each broken tablet, each collapsed wall, each fragment of ancient pottery is a piece of evidence in the ongoing trial of human ambition, testimony to both the heights we can reach and the depths to which we can fall. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of Mesopotamian archaeology is how familiar it all seems. The administrative tablets from Sumerian bureaucrats complaining about their workload, the Babylonian mathematical problems that could have been written yesterday, the Assyrian royal inscriptions boasting of victories that now seem as remote as the movements of distant galaxies. All of these speak to the fundamental continuity of human nature across the millennia. We recognize ourselves in these ancient texts not because we are fundamentally different from our ancestors, but because we are fundamentally the same. The same ambitions drive us, the same fears haunt us, the same contradictions tear us apart. We build our skyscrapers as they built their ziggurats, reaching towards some unattainable perfection. We organize our societies as they organized theirs, trying to balance individual freedom with collective security. We wage our wars as they wage theirs, convinced that this time will be different, that our cause is just, that our victory will be permanent. The lesson of Mesopotamia is not that we should abandon these efforts, but that we should undertake them with a clearer understanding of their ultimate limitations. Civilization is not a destination, but a journey, not a problem to be solved, but a tension to be managed, not a victory to be won, but a dance to be danced as gracefully as possible while the music lasts. The music that began in ancient Mesopotamia is still playing, though the instruments have changed and new performers have taken the stage. The same themes recur: the struggle between order and chaos, the tension between individual desire and collective need, the search for meaning in an apparently meaningless universe, the attempt to create something permanent from materials that are inherently temporary. Each civilization adds its own variations to these eternal themes, but the underlying melody remains recognizably the same. As we face our own civilizational challenges, environmental degradation, resource depletion, social inequality, technological disruption, we would do well to remember both the achievements and the failures of our Mesopotamian predecessors. They show us what is possible when human beings work together toward common goals, but they also warn us of the price of hubris, the danger of believing that our current arrangements are natural or permanent, the risk of pursuing short-term advantages at the expense of long-term sustainability. The great cities of Mesopotamia fell not because their builders were foolish or incompetent, but because they faced challenges that exceeded their adaptive capacity. The same could happen to us, not through any moral failing or lack of intelligence, but simply through the accumulated weight of our collective choices, the unintended consequences of our well-intended actions, the systemic effects of individual decisions that seemed perfectly rational at the time they were made. Yet the story of Mesopotamia is not ultimately a story of failure, but of magnificent, tragic, glorious human effort. For 3,000 years, millions of people lived and worked and loved and died in the shadow of those mud brick ziggurats, creating art and literature and law and science, raising children and building homes and burying their dead with dignity and hope. Their individual lives were as meaningful as ours, their joys as real, their sorrows as deep, their achievements as worthy of respect. The dust that covers their cities covers us all in the end, but it is not the dust of defeat, but the dust of completion. They finished their part of the human story, played their role in the great drama of civilization, contributed their verse to the ongoing poem of human existence. That their particular civilization came to an end does not make it any less significant than civilizations that are still ongoing. Indeed, it may make it more significant by allowing us to see it whole, to understand its full arc from beginning to end, to appreciate both its accomplishments and its limitations with the clarity that only temporal distance can provide. The final paradox of Mesopotamian civilization is that it achieved its ultimate goal not through permanence, but through transformation. The Sumerians who first settled between the rivers wanted to create something that would last, and they succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Not by building structures that would endure forever, but by creating ideas and institutions and technologies that would outlive any particular physical embodiment, that would spread across the world and down through the centuries, that would become so fundamental to human existence that we can barely imagine life without them. The true monument to Mesopotamian civilization is not the ruins that dot the landscape of modern Iraq, impressive as they are, but the invisible infrastructure of human knowledge and organization that we take for granted every day. Every time we read or write, we are using their invention. Every time we live in a city, we are following their example. Every time we are governed by laws rather than by the arbitrary will of the powerful, we are benefiting from their innovations. Every time we measure time or space or quantity, we are using systems they developed or refined. In this sense, Mesopotamian civilization never fell at all. It simply transformed itself, spreading outward from its original geographical boundaries to encompass the entire human species, evolving and adapting and improving itself through contact with other cultures and other ways of thinking, but always carrying within itself the genetic code of those first experiments in civilized living that took place in the valley between the rivers. The dust of Mesopotamia lies not just in the ruins of ancient cities, but in the foundation of every modern achievement, the DNA of every contemporary institution, the bloodstream of every living culture. We are all, in some sense, children of Sumer and Babylon and Assyria, inheritors of their legacy and trustees of their memory, responsible for carrying forward the great work they began and for learning from both their successes and their failures. As we write our own chapter in the ongoing story of human civilization, the silence that hangs over the ruins of Mesopotamia is not the silence of ending, but the silence of seeds buried in winter earth, waiting for the proper season to sprout into new and unimaginable forms of life. The experiment that began there 5,000 years ago continues in every laboratory and classroom, every parliament and courthouse, every library and hospital, every place where human beings gather together to create something larger and more lasting than their individual selves. This is the final testimony of ancient Mesopotamia, that human beings are capable of greatness, not despite our mortality, but because of it. Not in spite of our limitations, but through the very act of recognizing and transcending them. Not by avoiding failure, but by learning from it and building something better on its ruins. And in the end, when our own civilization joins the archaeological record, when our skyscrapers crumble, and our databases are corrupted, and our languages are forgotten, the same spirit that animated the builders of Ur and Babylon will animate whoever comes after us, carrying forward the eternal human project of creating meaning and beauty and knowledge in the face of an indifferent universe, adding their own verse to the poem that began when the first human being looked up at the stars and wondered what they meant. But perhaps the most chilling realization is this: we are not the inheritors of Mesopotamian wisdom. We are merely the latest iteration of Mesopotamian folly, destined to repeat their mistakes with tools they never imagined, on a scale they never conceived, with consequences that will make their collapse seem like a gentle fade to black.